work we do. Family Services of Greater Vancouver has been around since 1928. And in that time, we have been working with young people, families, and communities, helping people in crisis move into resilience. And these crises come in so many different ways, as many of you know: mental health, poverty, exploitation, victims of violence. And the goal and the focus of family services and the staff we have is to help people move through these crises and find out how they can get to a brighter tomorrow. Everybody deserves to have a brighter tomorrow, and building resilience is one of the ways to do that. Before we get going and I turn the mic over to some incredibly experienced people who are going to share with you some wonderful knowledge today, I'd just like to do a land acknowledgement. Family Services provides services throughout the Lower Mainland, and we are so appreciative and grateful for being on the unceded territorial lands of the Coast Salish people. This includes the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, the Squamish, Kakite, Cutsey, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Matsqui, Mission, Semiahmoo, and the Tsawwassen First Nations people. So thank you again for being with us today. I know it's going to be a very informative hour, and at this time I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Safey, who will be our MC for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for the land acknowledgement and the warm welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Safey, and I'm the VP Development and Communications here at Family Services of Greater Vancouver. We have such an incredible group of people with us today. And to get things started, we'd love to get to know you just a bit better. In a moment, you'll see a poll launch on the screen. We'd love to learn more about how you work with youth and what may have drawn you to today's webinar. While that's on screen, I'll share with you just a few housekeeping items. If you require any kind of tech support during today's webinar, please either use the chat function directly in the Zoom platform, or you can email my colleague Lisa at ltweeten@fsgb.ca. That's LTWETEN@fsgb.ca. I wanted to also let you know that we'll have an opportunity at the end of the webinar for a short Q&A. So if you have any questions for Brenda or Katrina, our lovely presenters who you'll be hearing from just momentarily, please use the Q&A or the chat function directly within the Zoom platform. Okay, has everyone responded to the poll? Thanks very much. So now, to really kick things off, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the campaign that we ran as part of Victims and Survivors of Crime Week earlier this month. We'll pop the campaign page in the chat for you if you haven't seen it already. The campaign and today's webinar were made possible by support from Department of Justice Canada. Thank you. The shocking truth is that exploitation and human trafficking take place right here in our communities, right here in our backyards. More shocking, though, is that across Canada, 40% of victims of domestic human trafficking for sexual exploitation are under the age of 18. As a society, we're responsible for our children and youth. We're responsible for their health, for their well-being. We're responsible for their futures. It's our responsibility to ensure that our children and youth live a life uninterrupted by violence, uninterrupted by the devastating impacts of exploitation. Family Services of Greater Vancouver plays a unique role in identifying and supporting youth who are victims of exploitation and human trafficking. Among some circles, Family Services might be best known for the work that we do with youth experiencing homelessness at Directions Youth Services. But today, we're focusing on two very high impact areas of specialization that we've been delivering to the community for more than 3 decades. Our victim services programs are embedded with police and RCMP in Vancouver, New Westminster, Burnaby, and Richmond. Our 18 victim support workers work with some of the highest risk victims of violence. They're at highest risk to encounter repeated or escalated violence at the hands of a partner, trafficker, or other member of the community. Our specialized trauma counseling programs across the Lower Mainland serve children, youth, and families who are survivors of sexual abuse, trauma, and family violence. We at Family Services are with people every step of the way as they find a path forward. I'm so thrilled to introduce our two speakers today. They'll be diving into this topic in a lot more depth than I can, from two different perspectives, both victim support and trauma counseling. First up will be Brenda Lochhead. Brenda has 30 years of experience in the anti-violence sector and has worked with FSGB since 2016. Brenda is the recipient of the 2018 Victims, Community Safety and Crime Prevention Award from the BC Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. Her expertise in the area of human trafficking is widely recognized across BC and Canada, and she was instrumental in the development and implementation of a coordinated framework for supporting victims of human trafficking. Brenda supports clients with strategies for exiting the sex trade and makes herself available to clients at all hours, often responding to text messages for support late into the evening and staying in contact with her clients long after their trial has concluded. She's deeply engaged with key stakeholders about the unique needs of victims of sexual exploitation and is dedicated to providing her clients with whatever support they need. Following Brenda's presentation, we will have Katrina Grabner join us. Katrina has supported children, youth, and adults who have lived through trauma for more than a decade. A trauma and family counselor in the Peace and Stopping the Violence programs here at Family Services, Katrina works from a truly collaborative, trauma-aware, anti-oppression framework. She believes in the agency of her clients, and her approach focuses on nervous system regulation and creating experiences of felt safety in the here and now at a pace that does not overwhelm. I hope you'll excuse me reading from the page on those ones. I wanted to get it right for my wonderful colleagues. But before we begin with the presentations and to get everyone settled to hear about these difficult topics, Katrina is going to guide us through a grounding exercise. Over to you, Katrina.
Thank you. It is really good to be with all of you right now. And before we start, I just want to acknowledge that it's pretty normal for our body to give us different signals when we're talking about difficult topics like this. And so I want to invite you to, if you're able to, access a gentle curiosity with yourself, knowing that any information that your body might bring to you in the next hour is good information. And so I just kind of want to give permission for you. Maybe you don't have to be good, perfect workshop students right now. And so I want to invite you to pay attention to your body's needs. So I have a rock here and something warm to hold on to and drink, a blanket. That might mean for you, you might need to get up at different points, move your body, mute it, go outside for a moment. Follow what you're noticing you might need. I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to invite you to join me in something called orienting. And if you're a youth worker, maybe you work with people who've experienced different experiences of trauma, this is something that's really simple that you can do together in session. So I'm just going to invite you to feel your feet on the ground. Notice what it's like to bring your presence to your feet. Sometimes I say, hi feet, there you are. I'm going to feel my hands. I might put one on my heart because that feels good for my body. You might try that out. And maybe it doesn't feel good to you. You might put it on your arm or on your chair. And I'm going to look around the room I'm in. I'm going to look behind me. And I'm just going to slowly allow my eyes to wander. I'm going to invite you to notice maybe different textures or colors that might be in the room that you're in. You might notice if the room you're in is safe right now. Maybe there's something you need to do to make it feel better. Maybe you need to close the door or open the door. And just see if there's something that maybe your eyes are gravitating towards. Maybe they kind of like looking at a color, or something feels neutral or okay to notice about a plant. And maybe once you find that image, just kind of letting your eyes be there for a moment. And you don't have to change your breath, but maybe you just notice your breathing. Just tune into that part of your body for a moment. And so throughout today, whenever you need to, you might just remember to feel your feet again. Notice maybe the object that you found. Maybe put a hand on your heart, or hold a rock, or have a sip of water. Thank you. And I'll pass it along.
Okay. With that, I'll ask Brenda to take the stage.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. Thank you, Katrina. I think we can all, throughout our busy and crazy days, take a moment like that and try to ground ourselves, especially those who are always running against the clock and working in really difficult circumstances. So thank you all for joining us in this webinar. It's very exciting. It's always exciting for me whenever I can expand the conversation around human trafficking and exploitation of youth. It's about education and awareness, but it's also about identifying what youth or who we are talking about, and how do we identify that they're actually victims of exploitation and trafficking. I want to talk about obviously intervention, but also a bit about prevention also. And I think that as we go through these slides, if you see anything on the slide that I don't bring up or I skip over, please, if that's something that you want me to expand on or you have a question about, we'll try to fit it in at the end. So first of all, for my slide, I am going to be asking for the next slide, because I'm not in control of the slide. So we'll just jump right in with the definition. I think this is important. I think that, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of the audience that are already involved in helping and working with youth who are at risk, who have experienced violence, and who have already been identified as being victims of trafficking and exploitation. So the definition of what we're talking about is not probably helpful and a bit repetitive, but for others, it can be a bit confusing of exactly what we're saying. When we put human trafficking in front of sexual exploitation, that can be a bit confusing in itself, because we hear of exploitation, we seem to recognize that. I think one way to really wrap our heads around what we're talking about is that exploitation can be on its own. We can have someone who's been exploited, there's a crime of being exploited, sexually exploited, without being trafficked. But when we're talking about human trafficking, it has to have exploitation attached to it, because that is the purpose for trafficking. Human trafficking is about gaining control of an individual, forcing them into exploitation for the goal of profiting off of that exploitation. So what we're talking about is a business model. We're talking about a profit-making business. That's harsh to hear, but that's the truth. And often we refer to it as modern-day slavery, because really that's what we're talking about. Next slide. So when we talk about helping and supporting youth, we want to be coming towards this subject matter from a trauma-informed place. What does that look like? For me, when I'm talking about trauma-informed, it means that I am aware that these youth, most likely, and it has been my experience, have already had trauma imprinted on them through their journey before we get to the place where they are being victimized by a trafficker. So I have to understand that if I'm there to support, I have to understand that there's a journey before this. And it's not for me to define what this all looks like and what it adds up to. So trauma-informed is understanding that for the youth, they have been impacted to a degree where they have lost their voice, where they have lost contact with their own agency to be able to make decisions for themselves from a place of safety. When we're talking about trauma-informed, we're talking about providing safe space. Next slide, please. So who is it that's at risk? Amanda talked about it a little bit, the statistic that we do have. We don't have a lot of statistics. It's an underreported crime, due in part because of the type of crime it is itself. One statistic that we do have is that of all of the individuals who identify as being victims of human trafficking and exploitation, 40% are under the age of 18. For myself, my client base, I see probably around the ages of 14, 15, 16 being that age group. I have had clients as young as 13, and I do know that some support workers have had even younger clients than that. So who's at risk? All youth are at risk. If we reflect back to ourselves, our young selves, and think about growing up and what our challenges were, feeling isolated and marginalized and being vulnerable are something that we can all relate at some level. The idea that the more a youth is marginalized, the more that they're isolated, that's what makes them more inclined, more at risk of coming in contact with a trafficker. One statistic from a study that came out of the United States has stated that one out of 4 youth who run away from home, they will have been contacted by a trafficker within 48 hours of running away. That is a stark statistic. It just shows that where youth are, where vulnerable youth are, traffickers will be there. And that same study came out of the UK, and their numbers were 1 in 3. So that's a statistic. That's a realization for all of us to understand that youth are at risk and what that looks like. Next slide, please. So I'm often asked this, like, what am I supposed to look for? And I just, it comes down to, well, if you've got youth in your life and you value them and you're engaged with them, if you see any of these indicators, there's something going on. And so this is the prevention part of the intervention. This is the journey before they are victims of a trafficker. This is that journey where they have already felt or lack a feeling of being involved and connected. There are needs that haven't been met for them along the way. If we're seeing personality changes in our youth, if we are seeing that they are physically and mentally not connecting, these are things that should be really red flagged for us as people who are working with you. Specifically for human trafficking, some of the indicators that will identify for us as those people who are there trying to support is something like branding, a tattoo. As I mentioned, this is a business model. This is about commodity, as harsh and stark as that sounds. So traffickers want other traffickers to know that they own this individual. So they will have them tattooed, and they will tattoo them with symbols, sometimes even a barcode. It could be the trafficker's name or initials. Or in one case, I had a youth who had tattooed down their arm, "I belong to," with the trafficker's initials. This is horrific for us to hear as caregivers and people who want to support you through this. This is awful, and we can identify exactly what this is. But this is where we run into some problems if we're not coming from a trauma-informed lens. We can identify what that is. For the youth, that's not how they're identifying this often. They don't look at the tattoo as a branding or a harshness. They may actually look at that as a proof of love, of a proof of that they belong. And so when we start our conversations and when we are offering safe spaces, we have to acknowledge that we have to let youth define what their experiences are. And that can be scary for us as support people also. Next slide, please. So we often hear this, I know I do, is, trauma-informed and meet the client where they're at. I like that idea. I think that's super important that we do that. But what is it exactly that we are doing? And what are we bringing to the table? So this is where I kind of talk about identify and don't define. If we're going to define the experience of youth, we are going to miss the opportunity to provide that safe space for them to have their voice. We have to give them time and space and representation to get to a place where they feel that they can trust in order to define their own story. Every youth has a unique story. I've worked with many youth who have been victims of human trafficking and exploitation. They're all unique, and they're all bringing a different perspective of what their experience was. The most important, don't define their trauma. We don't know what that is. And our trauma-informed lens isn't about defining it. It's about identifying that it's there and then allowing the youth to find their strength and their voice, their agency, in defining what that looks like for them. Next slide, please. So, how do you do it? How do we engage youth? How do we make those connections? When we're talking about a trauma practice, we're talking about providing safe space. And this is where we can run into that whole defining what this should look like. So if we're saying we're providing that space for youth, we don't want to fill that space up with our ideas of what safety looks like. And if we do that, already we're silencing the voices that we should be listening to. When we ask a youth, are you safe? Be prepared. Right away, if I've already identified that this youth is a victim of human trafficking and exploitation, I've already answered the question for myself. Absolutely not safe. You will be shocked to hear from many youth that they absolutely feel safe. They're with a person who protects them. They're with the person who loves them. This is their perspective, and we have to respect that that is their perspective. And when we ask, are you safe? We have to actually put ourselves in that process that we may be the person that's bringing them to a risk point, that we are the unsafe moment by asking them to talk about what's going on with them. So we need to be aware, and we need to understand, how do we create safe spaces? Next slide, please. So when I talk about safe spaces, what is it that we are offering? So we're offering the youth, an opportunity to figure out their stuff, to say, with me, just figure it out. I'm not going to impede on what that process looks like for you. This is just your time. We want to not be making judgments. We don't want the youth to feel that if they do come forward and they start talking because they're feeling safe, that there's some type of expectation that's attached to that support. That's what kind of ends those conversations. Because for youth that we work with, over time, they have had many people offer them safe space. And for some reason, they fall through the cracks. So they're not at a place where they want to believe that what you say is true. So how do we get to that place where they trust that the space you're offering is safe? And that is with relationship building. Next slide, please. You have to be able to build a trusting relationship in order for youth to start to believe what you're offering, this safe space, is actually true. I met a client about 6 years ago during one of the cases that I was consulting on. She was 15 years old. She was in her home with her parents. And I went there on an introduction. She wanted nothing to do with me, absolutely nothing to do with me. She wouldn't engage. She wouldn't have a conversation. So I just said, that's okay. And as I was leaving, I said to her, do you mind if I just check in with you? And I got whatever. So we all know working with youth, whatever could mean one, that could be a yes or that could be a no, that's a whatever. But she quickly followed up by offering her phone number. And she said, I don't want to be talking to counselors though. So to all the counselors who are here, I'm trying not to be disparaging when I adamantly told her I was not a counselor. So that was a positive on my side. What I did with that was every day I checked in with her. I sent a text, I said hello, I said, hey, how you doing? It's just me. I did that for almost 4 months. Nothing, dead air, but I kept doing it. And then one night, 11 o'clock at night, I was boiling the kettle to make tea. I heard the ding on my cell phone and I looked at it and it was from her. And it was, hey, I know you're not a counselor, but I want to ask you a question. Now, That's the beginning of a trusting relationship. I've already been tested. And now what am I going to do with it? I am not going to start defining for her everything that she needs to talk to me about. I'm just going to find out what the question is and see if I know any kind of answers for it. This is the building. And from that, we are able to create that safe space, and we are able to keep that continuum of care. If we lose the continuum of care, we lose the youth. It's really difficult for them to keep reinventing and discussing and talking about what's going on for them over and over again. Next slide, please. This is the question. This is the question that, it's a scary question. When I work with youth, I often hear them say, I don't know why you're talking to me. You don't care about me. You don't hear me. You don't see me. You don't know me. And there's a truth to them, because I'm just meeting them. I might have identified that they are a victim of exploitation, of a crime, but I don't know them. I don't know their experiences, but I am going to try to build a relationship from a trauma-informed spot where we can start sharing her voice and time and space where they feel safe. Do you see me? I have to be prepared to see them where they're at. And it might not be my expectation, and it shouldn't be my expectation. And if any time you feel that you have an expectation of what their experience is, then you're not going to be communicating. We have to give youth safe space. This is what trauma-informed approach really is. We're giving them the opportunity to really be seen because they're feeling safe, to really be heard. And then we are promoting this idea of getting in contact with their agency again, to take some control back, and from a place of strength, so that the next steps in their journey, in their interrupted trajectory that they have, is on their watch, on their call. And then maybe through that communication and this process, maybe we can stop all of this interruption and youth can start healing on their say. So that's a lot of stuff, and I could talk for hours and hours, but they won't allow me. They've only given me a certain amount of time. I hope this is helpful. I hope this is, like I said, an opening to a conversation. It's a much larger conversation. I think the most important is please, please, please do not define youth's trauma. And I think Katrina is going to give us some really good tips now about how we interact with youth to really protect that. So thank you very much for your time.
Sorry, I was muted there. Brenda, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. As you can imagine, the times, Brenda, that I've taken you to share your work with our donors, the incredible compassion and expertise that you bring to your client service is just unmatched. I'm so proud to have you as a colleague, and I'm really grateful that you took the time to share your work with us today. As mentioned before, Brenda is, of course, one of our victim support workers in the Victim Services Program embedded within the Vancouver Police Department. The victim services programs we deliver at Family Services are supported by the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, as well as by private and public donations. Often, FSGV comes up against the misconception that we're not a nonprofit, but indeed we are. If you're inspired by Brenda and by the work that we do, and you want to support victims of violence and exploitation, we will be popping a donation link into the chat. There are many different ways to support Family Services and the work that we do. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katrina Grabner, where Brenda works directly with victims of exploitation right in the midst of their crisis and through the criminal justice process. Katrina works in specialized trauma counseling with more focused work on long-term healing with the children and youth that we serve. Over to you, Katrina.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. I think everything I share will be really to back up what Brenda shared, because I'm so on board with everything with that trauma-informed approach. And I want to check in with all of you. What are you noticing? Maybe on the inside right now. Maybe there's an uptick in energy, maybe some fidgeting, or maybe you noticed all of a sudden feeling so tired. Let's just take a moment, maybe to feel our feet again on the ground. I'm going to kind of move mine up and down a little bit, like I'm walking. And I'm going to also lean back a little, and I'm going to notice my spine, notice where there's support from my chair holding me up. And of course, I have some extra energy because I'm talking to all of you. So I'm going to support my heart, which is beating a bit faster. And so anything you might be noticing in your own nervous system, like I said, we'll be curious and gentle with. And if you're a support worker, what I want to share is that getting to know your nervous system is one of your most important jobs and will actually help you to really better be able to sense what is going on in the relational field between yourself and the youth that you're working with. So let's go to the first slide. And so we all have a nervous system, and it's there to keep us safe. So we come into the world wired to connect. With our first breath, we embark on a lifelong quest to feel safe in our bodies, in our environments, and in our relationships with others. Our autonomic nervous system is like a personal surveillance system. It's on guard, and it's asking the question, is this safe? Am I safe right now? Its goal is to protect us by listening moment to moment about what's happening around us and with others. And that's part of why we were doing orienting at the beginning, noticing, oh, where am I actually in this present moment right now? And am I safe and okay? We'll go to the next slide. And so I guess what I want to really emphasize is that our nervous system is really good, and it's often working really hard. And same with our youth. It's very adaptive, and there's a lot of responses that we'll notice in youth that we're supporting that are very adaptive, but sometimes get a really negative rap, especially maybe in school systems or different systems that we have in place as a society. Sometimes there's judgments on these ways that are often body-based and not on purpose. And so I'm going to go through some of the adaptive responses you might notice, probably in yourself at times, and probably often in youth that you might be supporting. And then we'll talk about some ways that we might work with those responses or support them. And, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And on the first slide, it says that I got some info from Deb Dana, and she has a wonderful website filled with more information on the nervous system. So I just want to highlight that. But when you're working with youth, you might notice that sometimes there's a lot of energy, which we might label as this fight flight part of the nervous system. So I have this tendency, you might notice, kind of like their feet moving or looking around the room, difficulty focusing. Sometimes when there's been trauma, it's like our nervous system keeps kind of getting stuck at a certain spot. It's trying to complete a cycle that hasn't gotten to complete. And sometimes it's trying to complete a fight sequence. So you might notice more irritation, getting annoyed about different things, or trying to say no. There's a no that wants to come out. Reactions might be bigger. Things might go from kind of 0 to like way up here quite quickly. And you might notice it's hard for youth to make eye contact, for there to be social connection, or noticing surroundings, like really memorizing where they are. And this is a lot of energy. This is a body that's working really hard. And so often youth are trying to manage to soothe what's happening in the body with different substances, sometimes with self-injury, sometimes with sensory input, even like headphones with loud music. There's lots of ways that we try to support what feels often a bit out of control for the body. And we'll talk a little bit later about what you might do to support someone when there's high activation in the nervous system. But even one is sometimes you might, hopefully there can be flexibility in how you're meeting. So that might even, if there's a lot of energy happening in the body, maybe you go for a walk together. Maybe you have a shorter session together that's maybe only 20 minutes. You're kind of noticing what their capacity is in that moment. We'll go to the next slide. Of course, our bodies cannot stay at such a high energy state, fight, flight forever. And so we're often swinging up and then kind of crashing down into collapse, into freeze. Or that's kind of our baseline. That's where we're staying. And so I think we've all met youth who kind of have their hood on, really closed in. Sometimes with the youth I work with, we'll call it like being in our turtle shell, like really trying to find safety by pulling back. And often youth, when they're in that place, it feels really numb. People can feel really scary, really far away. But a lot of times, I think especially in school, sometimes people will jump to conclusions like, oh, like this youth, they're just not listening. They're not listening to me. Hey, why won't you make eye contact with me? Or they're always daydreaming, or they're not focusing. Or even sometimes people think maybe they're not as smart or having an ability to learn. But when we're in a collapsed place or even fight or flight, it's so hard to hold complex thoughts because all of our energy is going towards survival. So you might notice fogginess, difficulty remembering. It's going to be really important to give just the tiniest bits of information when someone's in a place where it's really shut down. Writing things down, taking things slow and at their pace is going to be really important as well. So noticing when maybe they're going into more overwhelm. Even offering things like cold water, having stuff that's physical, that can be touched or noticed when you're working together can be really important as well. Okay, next slide. And of course, we're mammals. And so a big part of us sensing safety with one another is relationship, which Brenda did a wonderful job talking about. And this is a part of our survival system as well. I'll go to the next slide. And so often a big part of when we're talking about exploitation is actually that attached part, that social engagement part of the youth and of themselves, that is working really hard to try to establish some sense of safety and belonging. And like Brenda said, there's often been situations before the exploitation has happened that has impacted that ability to sense, to find safety with others. And so it makes sense that a lot of times a youth has found some type of relational safety with someone who we would see as not being safe. But for a youth, this might be the first time where they're feeling some belonging. And so it can be really confusing because this is often a way that they are meeting some needs for themselves of safety, which is why it can feel like there's maybe different parts that are in conflict with the youth that we're working with. Like, oh, like we're fighting against something. And so it's so important in our work that we're slowly building relationship with them. There needs to be enough safe relationships outside of that situation for them to connect to. It wouldn't make sense to leave maybe one of the only groups that they felt a sense of belonging in if there is not a person or an individual where they sense even just a little bit, like 1%, like I can be seen and I can be myself and I'm going to be safe and okay. And so when our social engagement part is really triggered or sensing danger, we'll notice responses like it might be really challenging for a youth to even sense needs or name needs. Like you might notice they're like denying if they're hungry or needing to use the washroom. You might notice that they're either pushing you away really hard, or maybe they're trying really hard to kind of like kind of a cry for help response. Like, do you see me? Do you notice me? Are you there for me? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And then I think most of you know about triggers, but often when we've had experiences of trauma, our body has memories. We have body memories of what felt dangerous. And this is when one of those survival responses, fight, flight, freeze, will just kind of kick in all of a sudden. And for us, as a worker, it might feel like it's out of nowhere. Like, oh, we were just chatting and I needed them to repeat themselves. And whoa, all of a sudden there's a lot of big energy coming towards me, a lot of no or a lot of anger. And so just noticing sometimes it isn't always what it seems to be in the present moment. Sometimes something from the past is being worked out in that youth's body with us in the present moment. And I just also want to validate that we're mammals too. And so when we sense someone's body being in survival mode all of a sudden, maybe with fight energy, we will have our own responses as well. And so maybe that goes to the next slide, which is, this is about knowing ourselves. So getting to notice how your own body is responding. I can get triggered too when a youth or anyone I'm working with all of a sudden is in fight mode. Or sometimes with freeze mode, I'll notice myself starting to feel my own insecurities, like, oh, like, where are they? Am I doing a good job? I'll kind of start leaning in and noticing that I'm working really hard with them. And so I've had to do a lot to notice what's happening in myself and to lean back in the work and to ground myself and my body. And this is how we co-regulate. And this is how youth will start to sense our safe presence. And it's not that we're always grounded and regulated. It's that we know how to have flexibility and to adapt in the moments and to come back to ourselves and to come back to a sense of safety in the present moment. And that we're not shaming ourselves either. Sometimes it's about modeling with our clients, right? Like, oh, I'm sorry. I noticed myself get a little bit, I felt scared in that moment. I'm going to need to take a moment to support myself and have a cup of water and have my feet on the ground, just so that I can kind of reconnect in the present moment. And there's different things that we can do with our body language as we're regulated and grounded that can indicate that we're engaged, that the youth matters, that we're a safe person. And so we might notice, how hard am I working right now? Is my jaw clenched? Can I soften my facial features, soften my eyes? You might notice how much eye contact feels okay with the young person. So I titrate that, which means not too much, noticing what feels good and okay for them. So if you notice they need to look around, then I give more space, and I'll even notice like, oh, do you need me to back up or come closer? You might notice your posture. How is that? And even gestures, just noticing the pacing of how we're moving. And of course, different things will feel okay or not okay with who we're working with. And so I try to notice how they're responding and to adapt. Next slide. Yeah, I think I mentioned most of those. Yeah, but tuning into that positive regard. Youth, of course, they're so good at noticing if there's incongruence And so it really matters to be authentic, to be yourself, and to really, in an authentic way, notice what you are appreciating about who you're working with. Next slide, please. And I just want to do a word about this. So creating a safe space, this is going to look different for every youth. I think it says here you might offer to have sessions with doors partially open, but it also might be really important that they're closed and that there's privacy. So I think what Brenda said is really true here. We don't make assumptions, but we're checking in and we're noticing with them, like, oh, I wonder do you notice what feels better if I sit like this, closer or further from you, if we have the door open or closed? I wonder if it feels better if we do a 20-minute session instead of longer. So checking in. Next slide. Yeah, this one's really important. Really validating what youth are sharing with us, honoring their lived experiences, and affirming their agency, offering options or invitations, and knowing that sometimes choice, too much choice, that can be overwhelming. That can even be too much. And so we're really slowing things down, pacing things, noticing, tracking their own system, noticing if something we notice in their body language, even like, oh, I wonder if that is overwhelming. Let's slow things down a little bit. Next slide. So a big thing we say in trauma work is slower is often faster. And finally, I just really want to reiterate, this is the long game. This is about long-term relationship building and trust. And with these experiences, trust has been broken again and again. And so we need to be willing to be flexible, to adapt, to be with what's unfolding over time. And the name of this is uninterrupted. And if there's one thing I want to say is, if we can all try our best to not interrupt service providers. If a youth just senses safety with one worker, what can we do to help support that relationship with that worker for as long as possible? It doesn't need to be the counselor, the therapist. Maybe it's like a youth worker at the drop-in. Something about that worker is what connects and feels good for that youth and their nervous system. Then let's do everything that we can to nurture and support that relationship for as long as that's possible, because that's where a lot of the repair is going to happen. And I think this is where I'm going to end. So thank you so much for joining me.
I just had someone knocking on my door telling me I was muted. My apologies, everyone. I'm back at it now. Katrina, what I was trying to say is just a really sincere thank you for sharing your work with us today. The passion, the understanding, the sensitivity that you bring to your work, I know that it's changing the trajectory of families and the lives of the children and youth that you support. I wanted to share that the two programs that Katrina works within, our Peace program, as well as our Stopping the Violence program, are both programs that we are fundraising for this year to ensure that we can operate them at full capacity. If you are inspired by the work that Katrina has shared, there will be our donation link in the chat, but we will also provide some contact info to me and my team in a follow-up email, should you like to get in touch. Our victim services trauma counseling programs are supported by the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, as well as the Ministry of Child and Family Development, the Canadian Women's Foundation, as well as corporate and individual donors. Thank you very much for your support in helping make this really essential service happen for those in our community. Now, in just a minute, we are going to open up the floor to a brief Q&A. Quick time check here. We've got about 9 minutes for that. So please do populate your questions either in the Q&A function or in the chat function. And my colleagues will prompt me to share them with the group. But first up, we are going to do a couple of very quick polls. The first question is, having just joined us for this webinar, do you feel that you now have a better understanding of how to bring a trauma-informed lens to working with or caring for the youth in your lives? Don't be shy, please submit your answer. And the second poll question is to give us a better understanding if this webinar series is something that we want to continue for our supporters, our industry colleagues, and partners alike. The second question is, would you be interested in a future FSGB webinar? We'd love your feedback. Okay. Thank you very much for submitting your feedback there, and we'll make sure to take it all into account. So let's kick things off with our Q&A now. I'm going to start, if that's okay, with you, Katrina and Brenda, with a question myself. So for the two of you, how do you practice self-care while you're doing this important work?
Oh, Katrina, you go ahead.
I have a few. I think the biggest thing that's been helpful for me is actually seeing my own therapist and building a relationship with my own nervous system survival parts, and really starting to notice how to take care of myself. And really noticing my body. So I'll notice my body will give me lots of signals if I've seen maybe too many people in one day, or I've been taking on maybe more than is too much for me. And I have practices now that work for my body that might be different than other people's, but walking, it's bilateral and it's got movement. That is very grounding for me. So I walk to work, I walk home, and taking time to be by the forest or by water, having things in my office that remind me of that has actually been a game changer for me.
How about you, Brenda?
Yeah, my list is, so I do run. I try to keep running, and I find that's a great mental health action. I wouldn't call myself a runner, but I'm walking it really fast when I'm doing it. So I'll say it's running. I think for me is I'm able to put up very strong boundaries. I can read the room and I can read myself. And I think that for my own mental health and calmness, I have 2 grand puppies, and they bring me lots of joy, and I get lots of puppy therapy from that. And so I think those are the things that I put at the forefront of self-care.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I really appreciate that. I know it'll help many of the people on the call today. I just wanted to note that rather than submitting any kind of questions through the chat, I understand that it's not working. Please do use the Q&A function within the Zoom platform. I believe you can find it under the little more 3 dots down at the bottom right of your screen. Brenda, the next question is for you. And the question is, I'm wondering if young, vulnerable girls are still being approached at schools as a means to get them into the sex trade.
Yes, so there is a trend that we have noticed that youth are being, young girls especially, but it is a gendered crime, but we do have young males that have become victim of this also. But the trend that we have seen is that traffickers are focusing on young males offering them large sums of money to go into the schools and recruit and traffic their friends and those in their classrooms. So yes, it's still going on. I think that's really the ultimate point of all of this, is that where youth are, traffickers are. We have to just come to the conclusion that that is the truth of the matter.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. I think for so many of us, like we would never assume that that's happening in our local school to a youth that we may know or know of. So it's so important that we're telling that story today. The next question is, I think for both of you, is what is a question we can ask youth instead of, are you safe?
For me, that usually is my first question, because that is opening the door. Because, you know, when we say that, we're not talking, like, we might be talking about their physical safety or the threat that they feel under. When I ask them, are you safe? It might be, have you eaten? Like, do you have a place to stay? It's after this conversation of getting to know a little tiny bit and say, well, is that safe? Are you safe out on the street? Like, what can we do to make that safer? Like, if you're out on the street, somehow can I get you a sleeping bag? What makes that safer? So I understand the hesitancy of asking the question, but it really becomes bothersome and hard to ask if we're bringing our own sense of what being unsafe is. So it really is a good way to really connect with the youth and say, like, in this moment, are you safe?
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. The next question is, do you have any advice for child protection workers who want to have these relationships with youth, but there's still responsibilities we need to fulfill that sometimes go against that relationship building for them? Is transparency the only tool we have?
You know, this is a wonderful question. That is one of the reasons why I am so lucky in the job that I have, the privilege that I have to have time and a confidentiality with the youth that other workers just don't have. So I understand that that can be a huge barrier in the relationship building. I would think maybe that what could be helpful is to have that extra support for the support social worker who doesn't have that freedom to be able to say, I can't really carry all of that load, but maybe I can share that load with someone else. And so it's okay to bring someone else into that picture from that place of safety. And it's messaging to the youth that it's honest. I can't be all of that, but I can maybe offer someone who can fill in those gaps.
Thanks, Brenda. I think that that really illustrates the strength of the partnership-based model that we have throughout victim services here.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah, thank you. Katrina, the next question is for you. When I get overwhelmed in my work with youth, I've noticed that I tend to have a freeze response, which makes it harder to be present for the youth. What are some strategies I can use to ground myself in these moments?
Yeah, I would start by noticing how freeze might be showing up in other parts of your life, and really starting to get it to know this part of yourself, and noticing even your relationship with it. Is there shame around this part? How do you feel towards this adaptive response? Because it's showing up likely for a reason, and we want to start to get curious, like, oh, I wonder why your system is adapting in this way. And so, but practically in those moments where it's showing up when you're at work, it can be supportive to notice where you are, because sometimes part of us is like going somewhere else and almost is like, oh, this moment right now, maybe there's something not quite so safe and okay feeling. And so doing what we did at the beginning, we can do this. I do this when I'm working with people, because we can look pretty normal when we're looking around. So I'll look around the room I'm in, just kind of waking up my system, especially when we're in freeze or collapse. It can be even really hard to just make a little bit of eye contact or connection. And sometimes we'll go right away to shaming ourselves if that feels too big or too hard. So I would just break it down into the tiniest little experiment that you can try. So maybe feeling your feet on the ground, and then seeing what it's like to notice the other person. And you don't even have to go to eye contact. You might just kind of notice how they are and notice, oh, in this moment, are we okay together? But I would get really curious about how this adaptive response is showing up in everyday life and start working with it outside of work. And then it'll probably translate into your work with you.
Yeah. Katrina, thank you so much for that. I mean, we have in the webinar today, both frontline caring professionals as well as our supporters. And I know that tips like that can help any of us in our day-to-day and in our work with youth. I want to note that we're at 1 o'clock, 1:01 actually, and we have one more question that we will take, but if any of you have to pop off the call, please feel free. Before you do though, I just want to thank again, Katrina and Brenda for your time with us today and just for sharing your invaluable work. The work we do here at Family Services of Greater Vancouver is changing lives. We are serving people in their moments of greatest crisis, and we're giving them an opportunity for a different path forward. So thank you for the incredible work that you do, and to all of you on the phone who have joined us today, thank you as well. So with our last question before we sign off, this is a question again for you, Brenda. The question is, what should I do when a youth discloses sex trafficking or exploitation? What do we do with this information, including when they don't want to report it?
Well, that is number one. I guess you look at the silver lining that they're talking to you about the circumstance. So we're going to start there. So, and I think this is a good example of where let's not start defining what that means and let it be identified first that the youth is talking to you about something that's going on with them that's going to be scary. It's going to be scary to even have told you about it. So take your time. Of course, do a risk assessment. If we're talking about immediate risk, you have an obligation to report yourself, and you can have that conversation with your youth, which I often have to do is say, like, if I deem that the risk to yourself or to others is there, I have an obligation to report. If the risk assessment is leaving you in a place where this is your opening gamut to start having that relationship building, this is a good time because the youth felt safe enough to come to you and start the conversation. So don't panic and assess your situation, and you'll be okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brenda. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. Please do keep in touch. We're on all the different social channels, much more information on our website at fsgv.ca. And I thank you very much for your time and for your support. Take good care.